Britain was still standing, but the war was already lost. Not on paper, not in headlines. It was lost quietly, inside the men who were still being ordered to fight. This wasn't a famous defeat. It wasn't even remembered as a failure. Because what almost broke Britain didn't happen in one battle. It happened slowly, while everyone believed they were winning. When we say Britain was almost lost, we don't mean a flag coming down or an army surrendering. We mean something far more dangerous. This war didn't threaten Britain's borders. It threatened its endurance, its leadership, its men. History buried it because there was no single moment to blame, no dramatic collapse, just a slow erosion of confidence, resources, and resolve, until survival itself began to feel uncertain. At the beginning, nothing looked broken. From the outside, Britain appeared composed. Orders were moving through command, positions were being held, reports sounded firm enough to keep doubt away. There was no single event that demanded panic, and that absence of disaster created a dangerous sense of control. Control became the story Britain told itself. Pressure was acknowledged, but only as something temporary. Losses were framed as manageable. Fatigue was treated as a discipline problem, not a warning sign. Command believed the system was holding, and as long as the system functioned, there was no reason to question it. This is how real danger enters unnoticed. Because control doesn't disappear in chaos. It erodes under routine. Each day demanded more effort than the last. Each operation required more endurance. Recovery time quietly vanished, replaced by the assumption that men would simply adjust. And because there was no obvious failure, nothing felt urgent enough to change. Silence became proof of stability. Obedience became proof of strength. Endurance became proof that everything was still under control. But control built on endurance alone is fragile. On the front lines, something had already shifted. Men were not losing battles. They were losing energy. Morale didn't collapse. It thinned. Fear didn't explode. It settled deep, becoming part of daily life. Yet these signals rose too slowly to force immediate action. There was no decisive defeat to respond to, no clear breakdown to acknowledge, no moment history could later point to and say, this is where it went wrong. And so pressure continued to build, quietly, steadily, while command focused on maintaining appearances. By the time leadership began to sense that something essential was slipping away, it wasn't territory or position that was at risk. It was endurance itself. Britain was still issuing orders, still advancing where it could, still standing. But control maintained through denial always demands payment. And when that illusion finally begins to crack, collapse no longer needs an enemy to finish the work. But the real danger wasn't that Britain might lose a battle. It was that the pressure never stopped building, even when nothing seemed wrong. What made this war dangerous wasn't a sudden collapse. There was no moment when the front gave way, no single battle that forced Britain to retreat in panic, no clear defeat that demanded immediate change. Instead, pressure arrived in pieces, and then stayed. Operations followed one another without pause. Men were moved, redeployed, and repositioned before exhaustion had time to fade. Every demand felt reasonable on its own. Together, they became suffocating. And because nothing had technically been lost, nothing felt urgent enough to stop. Endurance became the unspoken strategy. Hold the line, maintain position, push just enough to keep control from slipping. But pressure doesn't need permission to accumulate. It builds in the body before it shows on maps, in the mind before it appears in reports, in the quiet realization that the next demand will arrive before the last one has passed. Britain wasn't running out of men overnight. It was running out of resilience. Fatigue became constant. Fear became familiar. Relief became something spoken about, but never reached. Yet the war still looked stable from above. Lines held, orders were obeyed. The system continued to function, just enough to hide what was happening beneath it. This is how wars turn without announcing it. Not through defeat, but through the normalization of strain. Men stopped thinking in terms of victory. They began measuring time by endurance, how long they could stay alert, how long they could keep fear sharp instead of dull. Because when fear becomes dull, danger becomes invisible. And once pressure stops feeling temporary, strategy begins to change, even if no one admits it out loud. Ambition quietly shrinks. Momentum fades. Survival takes priority, not because Britain accepted defeat, but because defeat no longer needed to be declared. The war continued. Orders continued. Orders continued. But the meaning of success had shifted. And as pressure tightened its grip, the consequences of every decision became heavier, not for those giving the orders, but for those carrying them out. And as the pressure kept rising, the question quietly changed, not how Britain would win, but how long its leaders could hold everything together. As pressure continued to build, it didn't rise evenly. It moved upward. From the front lines to the desks where decisions were made, the war began to press in on leadership in ways that were harder to measure and harder to admit. Command was no longer deciding how to win. It was deciding how to avoid collapse. Every choice carried weight. Every delay felt safer than action, because action meant admitting that something was wrong, and admitting weakness carried its own risks. Leaders feared the consequences of change more than the consequences of endurance. They worried that pulling back would signal panic, that adjusting strategy would expose vulnerability, that acknowledging strain would invite scrutiny they could not control. So, decisions slowed. Orders became cautious. Language softened. Words like temporary, manageable, and under review replaced urgency. But pressure does not wait for permission. The longer leadership hesitated, the more responsibility compressed into fewer decisions. Each order now carried not just tactical meaning, but psychological weight. Hold, because retreat might look like failure. Advance, because stopping might invite questions. Endure, because admitting exhaustion felt more dangerous than pushing through it. This is how leadership fractures under strain, not through incompetence, but through fear of consequences, fear of being remembered as the one who let control slip, fear of making the wrong move when there were no good options left, fear of choosing between visibility and survival. And while leadership wrestled with these invisible pressures, time kept moving, pressure kept building. And the burden of those delayed decisions did not stay at the top. It traveled downward. Orders meant to preserve control landed on men who were already stretched thin. Decisions designed to protect the system translated into longer hours, fewer pauses, and heavier demands. From a distance, command still looked intact. Structure remained. Authority held. But inside, something had changed. Leadership was no longer shaping the war. It was reacting to it. And once leadership begins reacting instead of directing, control becomes a performance, not a reality. But while leaders struggled to hold everything together, the real cost of those decisions was already being paid. Somewhere else, while decisions were debated higher up, the weight of the war settled elsewhere. It settled on the men who did not decide where to go, only when to move, only how long to hold, only how much more they could give before something inside them failed. These men were not thinking about strategy. They were thinking about staying alert, about staying awake, about staying alive through the next stretch of silence. Exhaustion stopped being an episode. It became a condition. Sleep came in fragments. Hunger became routine. Fear stopped arriving suddenly, and instead lived quietly in the body, tightening the chest, slowing reactions, dulling judgment. No one called it collapse. Because collapse looks dramatic, this was quieter than that, Morale didn't break, it thinned. Confidence didn't shatter, it faded. Hope didn't disappear, it narrowed. Men began measuring time differently, not by days or operations, but by moments of relief that never quite arrived, by pauses that were promised but delayed, by the quiet calculation of how much more they could endure before mistakes became unavoidable. There were no speeches about sacrifice, no heroic framing, no moments designed for memory, just repetition. Hold your position, adjust, move again. Each order added another layer of strain to bodies already carrying too much. And yet these men kept functioning, because failure did not feel like an option, not because they believed in victory, but because stopping felt worse. Stopping meant facing what the pressure had done to them. So they endured. They learned to move while tired, to think while afraid, to follow orders while questioning how long it could continue. This is the kind of endurance history struggles to record. There is no single image that captures it, no moment that fits neatly into a narrative of courage or defeat, just men carrying weight long after their strength had been spent. And as this quiet strain continued, something subtle shifted. The war stopped feeling like something to be won. It began to feel like something to survive, not proudly, not bravely, but silently. And slowly, without announcement, survival began to matter more than victory, and the war changed with it. There was no announcement when the war changed, no speech, no admission, no moment where leadership openly said that winning was no longer the objective. The shift happened quietly. Plans became smaller. Expectations lowered. Decisions were framed around what could be preserved rather than what could be achieved. Officially, Britain was still advancing where possible, still holding key positions, still maintaining the appearance of control. But beneath that surface, the language changed. Orders focused on stability, on containment, on avoiding losses rather than seeking momentum. What mattered now was not progress, but survival without collapse. This is how strategy transforms under pressure, not through retreat, but through caution. Not through surrender, but through restraint. Moves that would once have been considered temporary became permanent. Objectives quietly narrowed. Risk tolerance disappeared. And because nothing was called a defeat, the change felt almost reasonable. Leadership told itself this was adaptation, flexibility, a necessary adjustment. But adaptation driven by fear carries a different weight. Every decision was now shaped by what might go wrong. Every option was judged by how much strain it would add to already exhausted men. Victory stopped being a destination. It became a concept, something distant, undefined, postponed. Survival, on the other hand, was immediate. Survive this rotation. Survive this operation. Survive this week. And so the war entered a new phase, one without ceremony. Britain was no longer trying to shape events. It was trying to avoid being shaped by them. That change didn't show up in headlines. It didn't register as failure. But it altered everything that followed. Because once survival becomes the goal, every success is smaller, every risk feels heavier, every loss cuts deeper. The system still functioned, orders were still given, men still moved when told, the structure remained intact, but something essential had shifted. The war was no longer being fought to win, it was being managed to endure. And endurance, when it replaces ambition, always leaves something behind. Britain survived this phase, but survival came with a cost no one wanted to measure. The war did not end in collapse. Britain survived. That is how history usually records it, as proof of strength, resilience, and endurance. But survival has a cost that victory does not measure, and this war left behind damage that could not be counted in territory or numbers. Confidence was the first casualty. Not confidence in weapons or logistics, but confidence in judgment, in leadership. In the belief that pressure could always be managed without consequence, decisions made under strain leave marks long after the strain has passed. Leaders learned caution where boldness once existed. Risk was no longer a tool, it was a threat. The instinct to endure quietly replaced the instinct to confront openly. That shift did not disappear when the fighting slowed. It followed Britain forward. Men carried it home. Not as stories of defeat, but as habits of silence. As exhaustion that did not lift. As memories that did not organize themselves into clean narratives. These were not wounds that demanded attention. They did not interrupt parades or speeches. They settled instead into behavior, into expectations, into how future pressure would be handled. The empire felt it too. Resources strained beyond comfort. Trust thinned between command and those expected to carry its decisions. A subtle hesitation entered planning, the knowledge that endurance had limits, even if those limits were never officially acknowledged. This was the cost Britain never counted, because counting it would have required admitting that survival had come close to failure. That pressure had reshaped decision-making, that endurance had been stretched to the edge, that the system had nearly consumed itself to stay intact. History prefers victories that can be celebrated. This war offered none. It did not produce a clean triumph. It did not justify its cost with clarity. It left behind consequences that were easier to absorb than to explain. And so the damage was folded into silence. Britain moved forward, not broken, but altered. And that alteration mattered more than the outcome of any single battle. And that uncounted cost explains why this war could never be remembered like the others. History remembers wars that end cleanly. Clear victories. Clear defeats. Moments that can be summarized, taught, and repeated without discomfort. This war offered none of that. There was no decisive moment to celebrate, no final collapse to explain, no single figure to blame or praise. Britain survived, but survival did not feel like triumph. And that made the story difficult to tell. This war didn't fit the language history prefers. It couldn't be framed as heroism without ignoring the strain. It couldn't be framed as failure without admitting how close endurance came to breaking. So it was easier to soften it, to compress it into footnotes, to mention outcomes without examining the cost, to move past it rather than sit with what it revealed. Wars like this expose uncomfortable truths, that strength has limits, that systems can function while quietly degrading. That survival does not always justify the method used to achieve it. These are not lessons that inspire confidence. They complicate identity. And nations, like individuals, tend to avoid stories that complicate how they see themselves. There was also no clean narrative to pass on. No moment young officers could study and say, "This is where we turned it around." No lesson that could be packaged without acknowledging hesitation, exhaustion, and fear. So history chose distance, not denial, but quiet neglect. The war was not erased. It was buried under simpler stories. Stories where pressure had meaning, where endurance was rewarded, where outcomes felt earned rather than endured. And as time passed, silence did the rest. What remained were fragments, references without depth, mentions without reflection. Because remembering this war honestly would require admitting something far more unsettling than defeat. It would require admitting how close Britain came to losing itself without ever losing the war. Because in the end, Britain wasn't defeated. It was almost lost. Britain survived this war. That is the sentence history prefers to end with. Survival sounds solid. It sounds strong. It sounds like proof that endurance was enough. But survival does not mean untouched. What this war revealed was not how Britain won, but how close it came to losing something less visible than territory. Confidence eroded quietly. Judgment became cautious. Endurance was stretched to the point where silence felt safer than honesty, None of this looked like defeat. There were no crowds watching a surrender, no moment when everything collapsed at once, just a slow narrowing of options until survival itself became the achievement. Britain moved forward afterward. The system remained intact. The empire continued. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Pressure was no longer treated as temporary, endurance was no longer assumed to be unlimited, and decisions were shaped by memories of how close the system had come to consuming itself. This is why the war was buried, not because it was insignificant, but because it was revealing. It showed that strength could hold right up to the edge of failure, that a nation could survive without truly recovering. That collapse does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently while everything still appears functional. Britain was not defeated here, but it was changed. And history, uncomfortable with stories that end this way, chose silence instead. Because admitting how close Britain came to being lost without ever losing the war would require facing a truth far heavier than defeat.